Hello and welcome to the Soviet School of Chess. We are now proceeding to the next topic. We'll still be talking about tactics and strategy in general, and today we'll be discussing further characteristic of the pieces, namely obstructing and striking powers of the piece. So in order to demonstrate what a piece can do regarding obstructing and striking, I will show you just one example. So this will be a shorter lesson, but I think it's a very instructive example in which you can see what is the point of this idea. Okay, so let's go to the example. Okay, so this is the position. And if you want, you can pause the video and stop for a moment, try to think for yourself what do you see as the main characteristic of this position. Okay, so you may have noticed that this a pawn is the most important thing in the position. If white wants to win the game and it's white's turn to move here, then white needs to, promote this pawn. And this is the only way white can hope for a win because he's down on material. So the first thing you notice when you see this pawn who wants to promote is that this bishop is obstructing the pawn. So this is the first lesson, noticing that your piece can obstruct your own pieces as well. So you need to move this bishop. This is the goal from white. Okay, let's now look from the black's perspective. So what does black want to do? Black wants to stop this pawn from advancing, obviously. And how can he stop the pawn? Well, king cannot come to help, so he has to do it with the rook. So rook has to come behind the passed pawn, and then the pawn will be stopped. So how can rook do this? Well, rook can just take the pawn on c2, and then later on go to a2, and the pawn will be stopped. So this is the idea from black. And now white notices this idea from black, and white wants to stop the black, and he uses his bishop, which is now obstructing his own pawn, to obstruct black rook. And the winning move here is bishop to f2, and this wins by force. First of all, now black rook cannot get this pawn. It needs 1, 2, 3 moves, and the pawn will promote. So for example, if rook takes the bishop, pawn moves forward, the rook takes this pawn, and it's promoted. So now this bishop, you can see, is obstructing the scope of this rook. So this rook cannot come to a2 because the bishop is obstructing. So black has to find another way to come behind the pawn. So black wants to come to one of these squares. So black plays rook takes h5, now wanting to go to a5 behind the pawn and thus stop this pawn from promoting. And now white again will use his bishop, but not to obstruct, but to strike. So this is the second part, striking power of the piece. So now black wants to come to a5, and the bishop will go to b6, striking the square a5 and not allowing rook to come to a5. So what can black do further? Well, black needs to find a way to go to one of these squares. You can see immediately that a2 and a4, he cannot go here because he's obstructed either by his own pawn or by the opponent's pawn. So this doesn't work. So he has to operate on one of these squares. So a1, a3, or a5. So he plays rook to h3, trying to go to a3. But now bishop again uses its striking power, and the bishop c5 is played, now striking a3, and rook cannot come to a3. Okay, so rook has to find another square. He's looking to go to a1, so rook h1 is played. And by the way, in this position, if you go one move back, here bishop could also stop the rook by obstruction. So another winning move would be just bishop to a5. You know, now the bishop is obstructing the rook from capturing the pawn. So now if rook goes to a3, then just king to b7, you know, protecting the bishop, and now the pawn will go on and promote. So anyway, here bishop to c5 is played, now hitting a3. Now rook tries to go another way, so rook to h1, trying to go here to a1. But now bishop d4 is preventing this plan. So rook again tries to go rook to h3, going to a3, but then bishop just goes to b2. Now you can see that bishop is striking these two squares. So rook plays h5 again, hoping to get to a5, but now bishop to c3 is played. And now you can see that rook doesn't have any squares to go, so this square and these squares are striked by the bishop, and these other squares So if he wants to go this way, so these squares are all obstructed. They are not available for the rook due to the obstruction. So which pieces are doing the obstruction? Pawn, bishop, and his own pawn. And in this position, now black cannot do anything to stop the pawn from promoting, and white went on to win the game. So this is a very instructive position, very instructive example in which you can see how the piece can both strike and obstruct. And in this example, bishop does striking and obstructing. He performs both roles, and this is a good way to understand how these things work. Okay, this is it, a short lesson for today. We will continue further in the next lesson, so thank you for watching, and I will see you soon with more lessons. Cheers.